Yes. So, those of you who were here last time, do you have any insights from the last session? Anything that stood out for you? Anything you thought about afterwards? If so, unmute yourself and let's hear from you. While you're thinking, I do want to say that this is an active participation workshop. I'll ask you to engage, to respond, to use that chat box like crazy, ask questions as we go along. So I see something here. Let's see. Anyone? Any aha moments? Did anyone learn anything new that they didn't know before?
Rosemary, one of the things that I thought of that I thought was so important, and it's like I've thought of it before, but you just really drove it home, was that we didn't create this mess,
Mhm.
and but we're here and we still have, we need to get through it. So it's important to talk about it and to um, engage in these topics.
Natalie, thank you so much. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do. When we have these conversations, I think it can be scary for people. When I talked about, I don't know if I mentioned last time about why we don't like to talk about race. And one of the reasons that we don't like to talk about these issues on race and racism is first, there's a lot of blaming and shaming. The white people are afraid that they're going to be blamed and shamed. And people of color are afraid that they're going to be accused of playing the race card. And then it's really uncomfortable, and we don't want to offend people. We don't know what to say, how to say it, who to say it to. Do I say Hispanic? Do I say Latinx? When I grew up in California, we said Chicano. Do I say Black or African American? Absolutely. So these conversations are important to have, recognizing that we did not create it, but we all have a responsibility to fix it. Thank you for that, Natalie. Anyone else? Okay, if you think of something, just let me know. Jesus said race as a social construct. Absolutely. Race is all made up. Underneath the skin we're in, we are 99.9% the same. There's really only one race, and that's the human race. And while we know someone made it up and gave labels, and labels change depending on where you are, um, even though that's very true, we do have to recognize the stratification of race and the high value that's placed on white skin in our country. So that's important, even though it's made up. All right, so I just want to reiterate, like I did last time, that this is a safe space. There is no blaming or shaming. As Natalie pointed out earlier, we're all in this together. We are all growing together. I promise you, as you continue on this journey of racial equity, of racial justice, you are going to make mistakes. I promise that will happen. You'll say the wrong thing, you'll do the wrong thing, you will offend people, but that will just be a fraction of the amazing work that you're doing. I've made mistakes. I continue to make them. I misgendered someone not long ago on a Zoom call in front of their colleagues. Talk about wanting to hide under the table and just sneak off Zoom and click the button and leave the meeting. But I couldn't, and I had to face it. And we're going to talk about what we do when we microaggress, because microaggressions are sometimes really huge mistakes that we make. But when we make mistakes, we have to allow the space and grace to grow. We have to allow for that. And we have to be forgiving of each other. We have to be willing to help each other grow. I was on a Zoom webinar with a very good friend of mine. Some of you have heard of her, Mary Louise Himmeter, who created the pyramid model. And we were talking about Black hair. And someone, and Mary Louise said, so can we talk about how offensive it is to Black people when you touch their hair, whether they're wearing an afro or dreads or braids. And then the chat box went wild because dreads, calling locks dreads or dreadlocks is highly offensive. So they're like, we don't call them dreads because they're not dreadful. And in that chat box went nuts. And it was a wonderful example of giving people the space and grace to grow. So I was able to say, oh, Mary Louise, I know you meant locks. We don't say dreadlocks anymore because of the history of them being dreadful. And she said, oh, I'm so glad to know that. I didn't know. And that's that. That's it. That's all. We make mistakes, we move on. So can we agree to those community norms, everyone? Thumbs up. That we are going to give each other the space and grace to grow. Thank you. So here we are, 5 levels of equity work. We know that the first level is individual, being aware of and fighting our own biases. Second is interpersonal, how you deal with racism when it happens in your interactions with others. And then the next level being the community level, being accountable to the communities that you serve that are impacted by race. Institutional level, where your institution's commitment to equity is consistent with their actions, where your commitment to equity is consistent with your actions, which means that you are engaging in anti-racist practices. And then the systemic level, where you're really looking at policies and practices and laws and that harm the BIPOC community, the Black, Indigenous people of color, and you're doing something about it. So today we are between the individual level and the interpersonal level. We're going to talk about microaggressions. Now, in talking about microaggressions today, my assumption is that you know about implicit biases. And we know that everyone who is breathing and have a heart is biased. Again, this is not something we ask for, it's not something we want, but it's because we breathe biased air and drink biased water, and we receive messages about people that are recorded in our inner recording, and we don't know what those messages are. They come from our family, they come from our friends, they come from the media. And over our lifetime, we have this recording of messages about people, and those messages influence our perceptions, behaviors, and actions. Implicit bias can happen in any category of diversity. It can happen in race, age, appearance. Do you know there's even bias against height? That there's a disproportionate number of CEOs of companies who are over 6 feet tall because there's a bias that believes that short women cannot be leaders. So they're disproportionately tall. So there's bias everywhere. And while we are biased in almost every category of diversity, today we're going to focus on race. And people always say to me, oh, Rosemarie, it's not only about race, it's about ability and class, poverty. It's about so much, it's not only about race. And my answer to that is you are absolutely right. It is not only about race, but it is always about race. Always, always, always. No matter how you slice up the data, no matter how you dissect it and evaluate it, Black and brown children and families are at the very bottom. Black children and families are at the very, very bottom on every single indicator of child well-being, whether it's education, child welfare, juvenile justice, adoption, foster care, or whatever. Black and brown children are at the bottom. So we can't have these discussions without talking about race. So I just wanted to preface that. So when we think about implicit bias is actually, the manifestation of implicit bias, the action, result, and manifestation of implicit bias is microaggression. That's the action. That's how it shows up. And Dr. Sue, who's one of the seminal researchers on implicit bias, he describes it as a brief, commonplace behavioral, verbal, environmental indignities that create a hostile environment for marginalized or targeted groups. And this could be verbal or nonverbal, intentional or unintentional. And we know that microaggressions are constantly and continuously experienced. So they're constant. They happen regularly. You get the same negative comments on a regular basis, sometimes even daily. And many people who commit microaggressions, they are well-intentioned. They are folded into what they feel are compliments, and they manifest themselves verbally and non-verbally. Let me give you some examples. First, they come in three forms. Microaggressions include micro insults, micro invalidations, and micro assaults. Later on, we're going to talk about spirit murdering, but I just want you to know that you may hear people challenge the term microaggressions because what's micro to you may be macro to me. And we'll get into the intent, so be aware of that. So micro insults, they are conscious or subconscious, and they portray a negative tone that are connected to marginalized populations. And some people really believe that they're paying people a compliment. That's one form of a micro insult. So for a female athlete to hear someone say, "You don't throw like a girl," or "You're really good at soccer," or I've heard my daughter especially have heard, "You're pretty for a Black girl," or to say to a queer person, let's say to a lesbian, "You don't look like a lesbian." I had a student who is deaf, and someone said, "You don't sound like a deaf person." Or to say to a person, say to an Asian person, "You speak English so well." Do you see the negative tone there? Because when you make statements like that, it's revealing the stereotype you have and how you make that person the exception. I've had people say to me, "Rosemarie, you're so articulate." Highly offensive. Don't ever say that to a Black person because it is offensive, and what you're really saying is, I didn't expect you to speak like that. I expected you to speak in a different way. And the result of that is to other them. I get things like, "You're a doctor," or "You live in that neighborhood," as if because it goes against whatever stereotype people have. And it's very, very insulting. Micro insults can happen in a variety of ways. Some of you have experienced micro insults in that way, and you'll have a chance to share those in a little bit. But I just want to give you an example of a microaggression that happened to me a few years ago. Dr. Walter Gilliam and I were presenting at the American Psychological Association, big deal, the APA. So that's a huge deal. And this is what happened. I want to see if you can recognize the microaggression. This video, the sound is a little low, and the microaggression happens within the first 15, 20 seconds. So you'll have to listen very carefully.
This is Jim from the APA, and we're here to talk about a meeting that just took place here at APA headquarters on the topic of preschool expulsions and suspensions, and along that line, the implicit bias that goes along with them. We have here today two of the participants, Dr. Walter Gilliam from Yale University and Rosemarie Allen from Metro State University.
Anyone pick up on the microaggression? In the chat box, drop it. What happened? The doctor. Yep. Laurel says, ouch, absolutely. Now I have to tell you, I do not require anyone to call me doctor. And so many of you I've worked with over 20 years now. Rosemary is just fine. But we're at the APA. And when they introduced water, they said doctor. So if you're going to use people's titles, use it across the board. Now, I do want to tell you that victims of microaggressions are rarely in a position to defend themselves. Rarely. Because if I would have said, excuse me, I'm sorry, but I'm a doctor too, that would not have been a good look for me. So when you witness microaggressions, and we're going to talk about later on towards the end, one of the things you can do is interrupt it. And what's interesting is Walter noticed it. He didn't quite know what to do with it either. And then the moment passed. Watch, here it is here. And he gives me this look, and then the moment's gone.
University, and Rosemary Allen
Like,
from
what?
Metro State.
You see that? And I'm like, really? No doctor for me? Okay, well, then I just kept going. So that's an example of a micro insult. But I do want to say, I don't believe that was based on race. I believe that was based on gender. Working at the university, most males are called doctors and most female professors are called by their first name. And when students call me doctor, they usually say Dr. Rosemary. So I do believe that's a gender thing. The next form of microaggressions come in the form of microinvalidations. And this is when you dismiss a person's expressed feelings about being discriminated against. So if you have a Muslim friend, my dear friend Fahima, and she goes, when I walked by that group of people, one of them spat on me. And I believe it's because I'm Muslim. A microinvalidation would be, are you sure it's because you're Muslim? Or maybe they weren't spitting at you. Maybe they were spitting when you walk by. You see what I'm saying? That invalidates the person's experience. People who tell you they've been discriminated against, most of the time have gone through a severe process of elimination to get there. Because first, we don't want to think we're a victim. And by the time we say, that happened because I'm Muslim, they've already gone through the process of deduction. Maybe they weren't spitting at me, but maybe they were spitting in that direction. Maybe it's not because I'm Muslim. They've already done that. So by the time they verbalize it, believe them. Believe them. And even if you can't, there's two statements that you can say that will help people feel better. And it's a beautiful response, both of them. First, I'm sorry that happened to you. That's it. I'm sorry that happened to you. Second, I can't imagine what that felt like. How can I help? That's all. And I believe, this is a Rosemaryism, I believe people engage in microinvalidations not to dismiss. I don't believe that's intentional, but because it's very difficult to accept that someone you care about was treated that way. So when I told one of my good friends that I was followed all around the store at the Cherry Creek Mall, I won't say what store, but everywhere I went, this person was behind me. I was being followed. And when I said, girl, that lady followed me all over the store until I just finally left. And she said, no, are you sure it's because you're Black? What she meant, and I know her, was, I can't believe that happened to you. I don't want to believe that happened to you. Are you sure? Because I don't want to believe that someone would do that to you. And I think that feeling is what allowed her to say, are you sure it's because you're Black? So even when you have good intentions, the harm is immeasurable because that just added to my pain. So that's a microinvalidation. Here is an example.
Won't see here the sculpture Scaffold, a piece representing historic executions sanctioned by the U.S. government, including the hangings in Minneapolis of 38 Dakotas at the end of the tribe's war with the United States in 1862. Native American leaders protested the sculpture's inclusion, leading to the museum's decision to remove it.
Is that caving to public pressure because you're worried about that publicity?
No, I think it's being responsive to the Dakota community here and what it represented. That
Where's the microaggression? Which one committed the microaggression and what was it? You can type it in the chat box, or if you feel like it, you're free to unmute. Not quite. It's definitely related to Dakota's. Lisa, caving to public pressure, asking if they cave. Did you cave? That's such a microaggression. Yes, the interviewer's question, Cindy and Marisol, peer pressure, were you pressured? Did you cave? That is totally invalidating the views of the Dakotas. And that's where your Dakota response comes in, Martha. Did you cave? And I loved the other person's response. No, I think we were being responsive. When someone tells you that you've microaggressed, you have one job. Stop. Stop. Don't do it. Don't do it. And try not to ever do it again. I was the director of the lab school at Front Range Community College. Some of you knew me back then. In our East lab, there was a inset in the classroom where children can go in and sit, and they could go in and build, and it was lower than the rest of the classroom. And we called it the kiva. Oh, let's meet in the kiva. Oh, let's go build blocks in the kiva. And I had an Indigenous student come in, and she gathered the courage and said, may I tell you something? And I don't want to be offensive. I said, absolutely. She said, Rosemarie, the kiva is a sacred place for my people. It's holy, it's sacred. And every time I come here and I hear you say, let's go play in the kiva, or the kids are running and jumping in the kiva, I have a visceral reaction to it. And I said, thank you for telling me. And you know what I did in the next minute? I had a class meeting, and I brought the children together in the kiva, and I said, listen, what do we call this place where we're sitting? The kiva. I said, you know what I just learned? I just learned that to Indigenous people, the kiva is a holy place. The kiva is a sacred place. The kiva is where Indigenous people go and pray. Do you think this place is holy? No. Do you think that this place is sacred? Even though they may not have known what sacred meant, they could tell by my intonations that I wanted them to say no. Do you think this place is sacred? No. Do we pray here? No. Should we keep calling this the kiva? No. So what should we call it? And my little Connor said, we should call it the pit. And from that day on, it was called the pit. I was told that was a microaggression. That was probably actually macro to her. And in that second, we changed the name. It cost us nothing and meant the world to her. So when someone tells you that you've microaggressed, don't try to defend it or justify it. Apologize, ask for forgiveness, and move on. Microassault. Now, these are verbal and nonverbal attacks that are intentional and meant to hurt. They are intentional, and the person committing them wants to cause pain. For instance, like Amy Cooper in Central Park. Many of you have seen this, have you? This is the woman who was at Central Park. A Black man asked her to leash her dog, And she got very, very, very upset. He began to record her. She became more upset. And then she threatened to call the police to say that she was being attacked by an African-American man. And she warned him, I'm going to call the police and I'm going to tell them that an African-American man is attacking me. All of us know what happens, especially when a white woman calls and says she's being attacked by an African-American man. So she basically was putting his life in danger. That was a very, very, very serious offense. That was a macro. We said micro insult. That was more macro than micro. Now, let me tell you, even in this incident, the microaggressions that occurred for Black people, many people looked at Amy and said, that's awful what she did to that man, but look at the poor dog. She's choking the dog, she's choking the dog. And before we knew it, the situation was more focused on the dog than on the man. And we experienced that as a microaggression. Oh my gosh, she threatened to call the police on a cop. Call the police on this Black man and say he was attacking her. He could have been killed. The microaggression occurs when you say, yes, that's right, but what about the dog? Do you see how she's choking the dog? And you take that whole conversation that way. I am a dog lover. Oh, my dogs aren't in here. I love dogs. So I don't want people to think I don't. But a microaggression is when you're talking about a human life and all of a sudden it's sidetracked with the dog. And it's really interesting because after this aired, the organization where she got the dog from immediately retrieved the dog. It took a little more time for anything to happen because of what she did to the guy. So keep that in mind. Here's some other examples of microaggressions: avoiding eye contact or physical contact with a person who has a disability or a person of color, reacting with visible fear to men of color or people who appear homeless, where you extend invitations to events, but you exclude people of color, you exclude those with disabilities, and you exclude those from the LGBTQIA communities, or asking a multiracial person, what are you? Or are you mixed with something? Telling a person of color they speak good English, assuming that everyone in your group can afford outings that you afford. You know, young women who are getting married today, and this is a generalization, but I'm seeing before COVID, lots of, what do you call it? Right before you get married and your girlfriends throw you a party. Bridal showers? Bachelorette parties. Yes, thank you. So what I was seeing was these really amazing trips. Lots of bachelorette parties in Nashville, New Orleans, and all of that. And I always wondered, what happened to the bridesmaid who can't go? What happens to the bridesmaid who is struggling to pay for the dress, struggling to pay for the whole outfit, basically, and buy a gift, and now $500 to $1,000 for the bachelorette party? So be aware, there's some acts of microaggression when you don't take into account that some people may not be able to afford to go. So consider that, and then consistently calling someone by the wrong gender pronoun. Again, it's going to happen. It happened to me. When you misgender someone, correct it and keep it moving. So if someone says my pronouns are they, and I go, oh, well, you know, he, and then Lisa corrects me and say they, oh, they, that's right, I'm sorry, and keep it moving. Because you don't want, oh, I'm so sorry, I don't know why I can't get that right, I didn't mean to do it. And that's just really not necessary. Recognize it and keep it going, keep it moving. Because the impact of microaggressions on marginalized populations include a harm to mental health, emotional turmoil, low self-esteem. It takes all of your energy away. And then this catch-22 of how you respond. I went to a new job when I first started. Some of you know I moved from early childhood to youth corrections for a couple of years. And when I moved in, I became the third person in a team of 2. And it was a man and a woman, male, female. And every day at lunch, he would come in and say to her, "Hey, partner, ready for lunch?" Every day. "Hey, partner, ready for lunch?" And I would sit there and I'm thinking, I wonder why they never ask me for lunch. That catch-22 of responding. After 2 weeks, he came to her office and said, "Hey, partner, ready for lunch?" And I said, "Which partner? Me or her?" And he goes, "Oh, are you interested in going to lunch with us too?" I said, "Absolutely. And if not, I'd like to have the first right of refusal. I'd love to be asked." So that's that form of microaggressions. And it created this hostile work environment. And it may seem small to you, but every day around lunchtime, I had to prepare myself for it. And in about 2 minutes, he's going to come over and he's going to ask her to go to lunch and he's going to exclude me. Just get prepared. And it really took an emotional toil. And this is what happens to victims of microaggressions. Sid Berry would like to add an example of microaggression could be dismissing the way you pronounce someone's name. Oh my goodness, or avoiding having to pronounce it correctly, or saying, "I'll just call you so-and-so." Absolutely, definitely, that is an act of microaggression and an act of bias that happens all over the country. And I do want to talk about that a little bit since you brought it up. First, I want to say there's no unpronounceable name. There's none. There are some names that you may have to practice saying correctly. We must engage in the work of pronouncing people's names correctly. So that's the first one. If a family comes to you and says, "These are my daughters, Patricia and Adriana," you don't say, "Hey, Patricia. Hey, Adriana." You don't say, "I'm so sorry, I can't roll my R's. I learned a little trick." Substitute the R for a D. It works all the time. Had a staff member named Mari, M-A-R-I. And she said, "Rosemary, pretend the R is a D. Mari." It works perfectly. And before you know it, you will be able to roll your R's if you just practice. The other form of microaggression and I'm gonna, Yahira, I know I pronounced that wrong, and let me model for you how to do this. Yahira, I don't think I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Can you tell me how?
It's pronounced Yadira.
Yahira. Can you say it for me again?
Yadira.
Yavira. So Yavira, I'm going to make every effort to say your name correctly. I might check in with you, Yavira. And when I say it wrong, will you let me know?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
And that's what you do. Microaggression. Yavira, your name is just so wrong. I'm just going to call you Riri. Happens all over the place. I had a student just before COVID. Her name is Sashiko. One of my colleagues decided, that's just too hard to remember. I'm going to call you Sasha. And she started calling herself Sasha. When I very gently said, "We need to be careful, this is not okay." She gave me her permission. We are in positions of power, many of us. Do you think a student is going to say to the professor, "No, I don't want you to say that. My name is Sashiko, can you please say that?" That takes a pretty rare and brave student to go up against the person who have control over their grades, who have control over their children, and some of you have control over people's lives. So yes, we don't shorten people's names. And just to add to this, we also don't make fun of children's names. You don't. I had a set of twins, Champagne and Champel. Some of the staff members, "Oh, they must have been drunk." That's not your business. That's not your place. We honor children. We honor the names that their families gave to them and the spellings of names. Some people are very, very creative in the way they spell names. Just going back to what we learned last session about historical and generational trauma and history of inequities, keep in mind that during the time of enslavement and for many years after that, Black people were not allowed to name themselves. When they were brought here from Africa, their names were taken away from them. They could be beaten or killed if they used their African names. So they were never able to name themselves. And I don't know if you know that our last names to this day are names of our slave masters, of the people who owned us. So my husband's family, Allen, that name came from Master Allen, who was a slave master. Very few African Americans who were born here, descendants of slaves, have a name different from who owned their ancestors. So when you see these African American moms giving their children these 5-syllable names, that's precious to them because they have the ability to name themselves. And if you ever ask the origin, they would be more than happy to tell you. But what we don't do is engage in a microaggression by making fun of them or shortening them or mispronouncing them. Thank you for that, Yavira. Next, we have spirit murdering. Seems strong, but this gets to what's macro to you. What's micro to you may be macro to others. So what is spirit murdering? Spirit murdering is defined as a slow death. It's the death of a child's spirit. It's a death that's built on racism, that's intended to reduce, humiliate, and destroy. And the term spirit murdering argues that racism is more than physical. It's more than that physical pain. It robs people of color of their humanity and their dignity, and it leaves psychological, spiritual, and personal wounds and injuries. And it also argues that racism is traumatic because it's a loss of protection, of safety, of nurturance, and acceptance. And we all know that these are things children need in order to thrive, feel safe, and learn. And the spirit murdering of Black and brown children leaves a trail of unanswered questions. And these are things we have to think about. Whether you're a teacher or a social worker, a healthcare provider, whatever role you're in, where you touch the lives of children and families, we have to ask ourselves, how do children learn? How do they thrive after being physically assaulted or racially assaulted by the person who's supposed to protect them, who's supposed to teach them, who's supposed to love them? How does a Black and brown child learn to live, learn, and grow when their spirit is constantly under attack at school, in social services, in juvenile justice, in the health profession? Oh, we don't even want to talk about what happens in health. And their body is in danger, not only inside the classroom, but even inside a doctor's office. So we have to think about that. And then how does a parent grapple with this reality? And how are children's imaginations and humanity stunted by the notion that they're never safe because of the color of their skin? And then where does the soul go to heal when our protective spaces become a place of trauma? Just think about this. Schools, social services, healthcare. What am I leaving out, Lisa? All of those helping professions.
Yeah, I think you've got many of them. I mean, we've got home visitors on here. We have people that work, like you said, in juvenile justice. So I think, anywhere families and children are going,
yes,
they're hoping for a safe place.
Absolutely. Rachel says, CASA, these should be safe spaces, but yet these are places where they're traumatized. The source of my trauma was school. And it's so funny because we talk about trauma-informed practices, healing-informed practices, but we're always looking at the homes and communities, and we don't look at where many people of color have been traumatized or in our helping professions. So I've thrown a lot out at you. Now it's time for us to go into breakout rooms and unpack this. My prompt for you is to think of a time you were subjected to a microaggression. How did you feel? How did you respond? So that's just a major prompt, but you can also talk about anything during this last 40 minutes that really touched you. The spirit murdering may have touched you. The whole idea about bias, microaggressions around names may have touched you. But let's just go into our breakout groups. You're going to have 10 minutes. It'll be 5 to 6 of you in a group so that you have a little more than 2 minutes, a little less than 2 minutes each so that you can budget your time. Breakout groups are Vegas. What happens there stays there. When you come back, you do not have to report out. The only thing I ask of you is, if you're so willing, to please turn on your cameras, because in order for this to be a safe space and to share some of these things, people are much more comfortable if they can see you. When you come back, you can turn it back off if you like, but in small groups, let's turn our cameras on. All righty, any questions? Okay, we are ready. I'll see you in about 10 minutes.
I'd like to remind you to please re-choose your language of your heart as we break out into sessions that does turn off, and you will need to re-choose your language. And Rosemary, you're on mute. It's the favorite thing of
And I'm
2020.
sitting here going, okay, we're almost here. So we've all experienced microaggressions. Anyone like to share? Again, you don't have to, but if you'd like to share so that you can help other people understand that doing this to me is a microaggression. Jesus, I see you.
Yes, I'll share. And this was just because it was a recent situation that I had. I was in my group, I shared that actually 2 instances. First, in my workplace, now with the pandemic, the option to work from home, it's available when you can. And so I shared with my group that I was questioned. So my colleagues are white, and I know this is, this is really, that's what it is. And I've been able to express that now just because of all these trainings that I've attended. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Rosemary and Lisa, for providing these opportunities. Just the way that I react now, or that I can have a conversation, I think it has made a difference by all of these trainings that I've taken. Anyway, so I was questioned of, the question came up where my colleague said, do you have 2 offices? And I was like, no, why? And she's like, well, I hardly see you here. And I was like, well, it's still the pandemic and we work from home, or sometimes we're allowed to come to the office. And so I was doing both. And I know that question was not asked to my colleagues that are, in the first floor, and that they're not questioned when they're not in the office. So it was more of a, are you really working? And the other instance was just last week, where I received some donations and I was helping move some of the school supplies that we got donated. And so this, we were talking about, what I did before as far as my job. And I mentioned that I worked for Jeffco Public Schools for 13 years. And right away, without asking me what did I do, she said, oh, so you work as a custodian. You worked as a custodian in facilities. And I was like, no, I actually was the program manager for the interpreters for the whole district. And then I moved to MSU Denver for 2 years. And after that, I came to the city of Thornton. And that was a very, but I think I responded quite well.
Yes, you did, Jesus. And did everyone hear the microaggressions there across the board? Next session, when we talk about creating an anti-racist environment, we're going to talk about daily acts of bias. But a big part of it also is the policing of BIPOC bodies. where you're heavily policed. Are you where you say you're going to be? And if I don't see you, you must not be working. And that's common across the board. So thank you so much for that. And also, so you had the policing of the body, but assuming people work in stereotypic roles, you must have been the janitor, you know, not understanding that all people who are Spanish speaking or Hispanic from the Latinx community are not janitors. So that's a big one. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Yes, Madonna? Mandana, thank you.
Thank you. First off, I want to thank you all for these trainings. They've helped me self-reflect, and I didn't realize how much has happened that I never realized happened. Likewise, I can become more aware so that hopefully I don't put other people in an uncomfortable situation. So I'm going to work on myself as well. But something I shared in my group and what came to my mind, I'm not sure, I guess, I don't know if it's micro or macro, but when I was in 6th grade, one of my teachers, she had split us into groups. And one of the groups she had split us in, it so happened to be with a group of kids who their second language was English. And so I was sitting at the table and they were speaking Spanish, and she came over by me and she's like, "Why aren't you doing your work?" I go, "I don't know what they're saying. I don't speak Spanish. My dad is from Iran." And so I didn't know what else to say. Here I am, this 11-year-old, and my teacher's like, "Why aren't you doing your work?" So I just, at that time I let it go. And I think I'm more of a passive person. So there's a lot of things I just let go to the wayside.
Well, Mandona, thank you so much for that. All of the assumptions around language. My grandmother was biracial, but she looked very Hispanic. And people would just come up to her and speak Spanish all the time. And I saw her, she was in the hospital. Her same nurse, she came in, started speaking Spanish. And my grandmother got so frustrated because it's like the 3rd time she told her, "I don't speak Spanish." And she kept speaking Spanish. My grandmother just let her go on and on and on and on. And then she goes, I don't know how you say, "Do you understand? ¿Qué pasó?" Maybe someone correct me. But my grandmother said, "I didn't understand a word you said." Jesus, you're about to tell me what it is. Do you understand? No? Okay. So also another microaggression one of my staff members experienced in terms of language is that she is 5th generation Mexican in this country. And she grew up at a time when families wanted their children to speak English, so that she's that generation that lost their language. And people almost attack her. "Well, why don't you speak Spanish? Do you speak Spanish?" That's very personal. So we want to be very careful of that. Other common microaggressions before we move on. We talked about the names. What I didn't talk about, and I may have mentioned, touching Black people's hair. That's huge. I see Andrea over there like nodding. Yes, it's just so sad that we learn even like at 2, this. You learn it very, very, very quickly. Hair is a big deal. Maybe next session I'll go more into it, especially those of you in the helping field when it comes to Black hair. We need to have that talk. And one of the reasons, especially those of you who are here from juvenile justice, when I was at DYC, I saw a young lady, her hair was dry and brittle and crunchy, African-American woman. And I said, "Baby, what's happening with your hair?" And she said, if I don't wash it every day, I'll get demerits. And it told me we have a lot of culturally responsive practices to talk about. If you don't know that this little girl can't wash her hair every day using your shampoo. So we'll get into that next time. Can we hold on to that? All right, let's go back to the slideshow.
Rosemary, I was just going to mention, I think there's one more that I hear often, and that's, "Where are you from?"
Where are you from? Absolutely. Where are you from is big, and it's one of those ways of othering someone, saying you're not from here, you're not like us, somehow you don't belong. That's a really big deal. I got one the other day walking in my neighborhood, I live in Lone Tree, Douglas County, down south. And I'm walking in my neighborhood, and she goes, "Are you from around here?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Do you live here?" And I'm just sitting here thinking, how am I going to respond in a way that makes her understand that this is inappropriate? And I looked at her and I said, "You must be new to this neighborhood." She goes, "Not that new." I said, "Well, how long have you been here?" She said, "I've been here about 2 or 3 years." I said, "Well, I've been here 23 years. That's why I haven't seen you." And just kind of left it alone, but very offensive. Those ways that make people feel like they don't belong, or like Jesus said, prove how you belong, because now our body is being policed. Thank you so much, Lisa. So here we are, kind of. So we had our small group time, our breakout time, but now what? Now what? We've talked about microaggressions, we talked about spirit murdering. So what do we do with that? In order for us to do our work, in order for this to occur, which is allowing children to thrive, not aggressing, not engaging in spirit murdering, there must be a relationship. And relationships are not just emotional, but they are physical. They occur at the intersection of mind and body. And so many times when we talk about relationships, we don't talk about the brain science behind them. Relationships, again, occur at the intersection with mind and body. In order for a relationship to occur, people have to feel safe. So very, very quickly, just some brain stuff. You've heard of the amygdala. You've probably heard of the hippocampus, the RAS system, the amygdala. And when the amygdala is triggered, stress hormones are sent out from the body. And when this happens, people go into fight, flight, or freeze. All of your energy is focused on surviving. All of us have been in a situation where our amygdala was triggered. Anyone have a boss that's a little difficult, and they come in and you could tell they're not happy, and they ask for a report that they told you wasn't due till Friday, and it's Tuesday? I need that report. Anybody? Or something similar? You know how your brain, all of a sudden you can't think? I thought it was due Friday. What does she mean by that? You can't think, you can't answer any of their questions, because all of a sudden your trigger your amygdala is triggered, and you're unable to respond. You're unable to interact appropriately. You're unable to answer any questions. And this is what happens to children and their families when the environment is inattentive or hostile. It triggers the amygdala. The body goes into high alert, and it sends a message to the brain that there is a social, emotional, intellectual, spiritual threat. You're not safe here. Jesus, is it okay if I use your story for a minute? Okay, Jesus said that this person asked him, "Do you have 2 offices?" I'm making this up, Jesus. His body, his amygdala was probably triggered. What does she mean by that? What does she think? I'm not working? It's triggering. I'm not safe with this person. This person is hostile towards me in that way, because they think I'm not working. Now I have to justify where I am and what I'm doing. That's what happens. The amygdala is triggered. The amygdala is triggered when a child walks into your classroom at 3 and 4 years old and they're not greeted. It's triggered. Have you ever walked into an environment with people you know and nobody turned around and said hello? Triggered. What's going on? What's the matter? The amygdala is certainly triggered in social services situations, sometimes even home visiting. You show up at a time that people aren't prepared. They don't want you there. They don't feel like they have the option of saying not today. So if the environment feels hostile or inattentive. Now, the other way that we can trigger children's amygdalas is by quizzing them all the time. And we don't mean to. Let me give you an example. How old are you? Do you have any brothers? What color is this? What shape is this? Boom. Just imagine right now if I say, give me Piaget's stages of development by name. What about Erik Erikson? What theorist created the tabula rasa? How many bones are in the inner ear? You know, can you imagine? You go, wait, what, huh? I didn't know this was going to be a quiz. That's the same thing we do to children. They don't always feel safe when we start just out of nowhere throwing these questions at them. That may feel hostile. So if it's hostile, or if they are not getting attention, if families are not getting attention, I have had my amygdala triggered at TJ Maxx, just going up to the jewelry counter and watching other people served before me. It's there, it's inattentive, and it feels hostile. So we want to be careful, because once the amygdala is triggered, the body releases these hormones that makes building relationships, interacting, and learning impossible. Because when the environment is unwelcoming, the brain experiences anxiety because it doesn't produce enough oxytocin. And then it triggers the brain into thinking it's in danger because it doesn't experience a sense of community. In order for us to prevent microaggressions, spirit murdering, and to build relationships, we have to be concerned about that intersection of mind and body and make sure people feel safe. And here we are in our helping professions, and sometimes we start out making people feel unsafe because we want to get to know the family. So our intentions are good, and then we do things like send home a questionnaire. At what age did your baby sit? At what age did your baby do this? What are the things your baby likes? How many children do you have? All of those questions that seems very innocuous, no big deal. If you don't have a relationship with some people in some communities, that's very, very, very imposing and offensive, that you don't ask me about my family or my child if I haven't met you. So we want to be very careful in how we do things, how we interact with people, and find out what people really, really need. Because children and families need to feel valued, and they need to feel safe, because the brain won't seek connections if there's a perceived threat to their well-being. I won't. If you start out saying, you know, Rosemary, you're very articulate. I'm kind of triggered, like, what did you expect? Am I gonna have to spend the rest of our conversation disproving stereotypes? You know, so be very careful of that. And then we have to really think about some of the specific emotional needs of children of color. And I do want to say that even as I talk about children of color, what's good for children of color is good for all children. But if we start with their specific needs, everyone's needs are met. But when we start more general, then we may not get down to the basic needs of those who are most impacted. So one of the ways that's specific to meeting the needs of children of color is leveraging social emotional learning to promote equity. Because social emotional learning, when we use it to promote equity, it affirms diverse cultures and backgrounds. When we understand that all children bring with them, everywhere they go, who they are, their identities, their strengths, their values, their lived experiences, and they bring their culture. And if we don't understand and respect that, you can't build relationships, social emotional learning will be impacted, we will microaggress and spirit murder. We have to know who children are and accept who they are, their values and their strengths. So how many of you are hearing a lot about learning loss and getting ready for children as they're returning to school? Anybody hearing about that? How are they going to catch up? There's been so much inequity. What are we going to do? I'm going to encourage you to steer away from that deficit thinking. And when you hear it, help people to think differently, because in early childhood, and that's across the board, no matter what discipline you're in, we always say families are the first, best, and most consistent teacher in their children's lives. But do we believe it? Because if we believe it, if we truly believe it, we would know that during this quarantine pandemic period, children have been with their first, best, and most consistent teachers. And if that's true and we believe it, where's the loss? Where's the loss? Just imagine this. Children have been at home, speaking the language of their hearts, eating their food with the people who love them, people who are encouraging, inspiring, and supporting them. And we're saying they're behind because we haven't had control of them, because we don't trust that people of color can teach their kids. We need to check ourselves and our own biases with that, because learning doesn't stop depending on your environment. Children learn in whatever environment they're in. They're going to learn. Perhaps we need to change what we're measuring, because children have learned to be resilient and flexible and log onto a computer, and suffering through sitting in front of a computer for hours. Some of them have learned to get up and make their own peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and come back. They've learned to regulate their emotions and know when they need to stand up and when they need to sit down. Families have learned how to anticipate. Children with special needs now, families are seeing them and seeing what their triggers are and the extra supports they need. There's so many wonderful things that have happened over this year. Please shift your thinking to partner with families. Family engagement is at an all-time high. How are we going to leverage it? Leverage that so that we can see what children have learned and extend that learning into our classrooms. Social emotional learning offers new ways for adults to examine their own competencies. We're always talking about children need to learn pro-social skills, and children need to learn how to share, and children need to learn how to initiate play. Do you know how? Because you know what? This is a Rosemaryism. I don't think sharing is natural. I really don't. I mean, if my husband came in here with a new wife and say, I have enough love to share between the two of you, that just wouldn't work for me. Or, you know what? I have to tell you, you see my pink office here? This is by design. The chair that I'm sitting in is pretty small. I love pink. That's the number one reason I have a pink office. But the other reason is that my husband hates it and he can't fit in my chair. So he has learned to stay out of my office. I don't want to share my office. It's not natural. So we have to learn how to do these things. Let me show you something. When he comes to my office, he's got to pull that little white folding chair out to sit. Seriously, I don't want to share. Don't squeeze in my chair. So when we talk about children's social emotional competence, where's ours? Are you able to regulate your emotions? Because usually what we see with children in our classrooms, in their homes, in CASA, a lot of it is typical childlike behavior. Typical. You see it in children all the time. You can anticipate it. You can be at a supermarket behind a cart with a mother with a 2-year-old in the cart who wants something. You could tell by the way the child's body moves after the mom says no if it's going to be a meltdown or not. Those of you who know child development, you know, you go, uh-oh, meltdown coming. So why are we surprised? The surprise shouldn't be the meltdown. The surprise should be how we react to it. So we have to acknowledge and address the larger impact of systemic and individual bias, but we also have to look at our own behavior. We have to reflect on our identities, our assets, our biases, and we have to engage in culturally responsive, culturally relevant, and culturally sustaining practices, especially around engaging in conversations about equity. So as teams, and some of you here today are members of a team, you have to look at disaggregated data, analyze root causes of disparities, and engage various stakeholders into developing policies and practices that support equity. So what does this look like? It looks like teams that students, families, community partners, stakeholders, they're all active in the implementation of a social-emotional learning plan they're represented on the team, and you're engaging everyone and getting varied perspectives and feedback. But more than anything, it looks like you being aware of where you are socially and emotionally. We don't always take a look at ourselves. You know, what are your triggers? What makes you snap? Because we all do. What infuriates you, and what areas can you grow? What about a family's behavior makes you crazy? What is it that make you say the most forbidden statement, I believe, in working with children and families? This is forbidden as far as I'm concerned. These people just don't care about their kids. What makes you think that? So I want you to get in touch with that. We are going to go into breakout groups, and this is a working group. So you're going to have 15 minutes, and you're going to fill out a self-assessment, and it's going to look like this. This is actually the first part of it. In terms of self-awareness, this is your personal assessment and reflection tool. I want you to look at yourself and say, I'm able to identify, recognize, and name my emotions in the moment. That's easy to say yes. Oh, yes. But you know, many people experience hurt as anger. Have you ever been hurt, your heart hurt, but you express it as anger? That's how deeply I want you to go. Am I mad or am I hurt? Can I label that in a moment? Am I mad at this family or am I disappointed in this family? You know, and then I recognize the relationship between my feelings and my reactions to people and situations. My team told me something I did not know about myself, that when a person is really biased and showing a lot of bias in a meeting, I very quietly start packing my things. I had no idea I did it. She said, oh yes, you start closing your book and you'll pick up your pen and put it away. And she said, you don't leave, but that's when I know you're done. And nothing they say after that can be resolved. I had no idea I did it because I was unaware, that one, of how my feelings were exhibited in that situation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to put a link in the chat box. And I sure hope this works. And then you copy the link and paste it when you get into your breakout group, and you will be able to pull this up on your computer. Those of you who are on your phone, I don't know how to tell you to do this. Oh, I just realized something. When we talk about language justice, I don't have it in Spanish. Is the interpreter, I wonder if the interpreter can hear me. Yes, because you're translating. Is there a way to read each section in Spanish? And while you're doing that, I will go online and try to find a Spanish version. Okay? Yes. Okay, all righty. So there we are. And this is a 15-minute breakout. And again, this is a safe space. So I'm hoping you'll get as far as you can and talk to your group about it. If you say, I feel confident that I can handle whatever comes along with calm self-assurance and a relaxed presence, say, you know, sometimes not, and you can have a discussion. That's what I'm hoping. Okay, everyone clear? We're good? Did everyone copy and paste the, let me just make sure this is the right one. Yes, the self-assessment. All righty, so I will see you in 15 minutes. See you. Welcome back. How did that go? Pretty good? Insightful? isn't it rare that people ever ask us to assess our own social emotional growth? You found areas you were really, really strong in? Anybody found areas that are growth opportunities? So this is what I want you to do. This is your homework. I want you to complete the assessment. Complete the assessment and then create a plan, because you cannot be as effective with children if you are not aware of your own social emotional learning. There's another part of that. Be aware of how your social emotional triggers can be tied to bias. Okay? And we'll talk about that a little more in our session on creating an anti-racist environment. But sometimes your triggers are tied to bias. I have a friend who I love and adore, but I don't agree with everything she believes. And she has such an issue with people with accents. That's another act of bias, assuming people with accents are not intelligent. So be aware of your triggers, and how they impact your social emotional growth, and then in turn, how you respond to others as a result. I cannot believe that I only have 10 minutes left. So let's get going. Is there anyone who'd like to share anything? Okay, let's get going here. And as I wrap up talking about this whole idea of microaggressions, we talked about impact versus intent. Because you didn't mean anything by it doesn't mean it did not create harm. Your intent does not diminish the harm that's caused. When you've been told that you microaggressed, and it takes a brave person to tell you that because most people won't, think about you and your friends. You have a friend who hurt your feelings, and you go, she really hurt my feelings. And the person you're talking to saying, well, why don't you let her know? Well, I know she didn't mean it. If I tell her, she'll really be hurt. If I tell her, it'll hurt her. So we're always like, I don't want to tell her she hurt me because then it'll hurt her and then she'll be really sad and I don't want to make her sad. Anybody else go through that whole thing? I go through it all the time. So by the time a person says, oh, Rosemary, I need to tell you that was a little offensive to me, it's time for me to listen. And the key is to listen. Remember, it's not about you. So remember, no defending, no justifying. Don't make it about you. And one more thing you can't do. Here goes Rosemary. Can't cry. And why am I saying that? Because when you start crying, I would never say such a thing, and I'm not a racist, and I don't want you to think that. All you've just done is make it about you. And I'll have to tell you, many people feel manipulated by those tears. I keep a box of tissue in my office, every office I have, and I say, it looks like you're sad, like you're having a hard time. I'm going to step out and give you a few minutes to get yourself together. And when I come back, we'll finish our conversation. You make it about you, and then the victim is comforting you, and that's not okay. So being aware of your social emotional learning, sit with your discomfort. That's going to be very, very, very important. One of the ways we prevent microaggressions is by practicing cultural humility. And I like to call that the practice of not knowing. It allows us to be the student, to release judgment in everything we know, we think we know about people and their culture, and to learn from them. Kyle Schwartz, who's a DPS teacher, she sent her this assignment home with her children. And she said she learned more about them than she ever thought she knew. And she asked the students to complete this sentence. I wish my teacher knew. This is what she got back. I wish my teacher knew I don't have a friend to play with me. I wish my teacher knew sometimes my reading log is not signed because my mom is not around a lot. I wish my teacher knew I don't have pencils at home to do my homework. I wish my teacher knew how much I miss my dad because he got deported to Mexico when I was 3 years old, and I haven't seen him in 6 years. What do your families wish you knew? What do your children wish you knew? We're not going to break out, but what do your team members wish you knew? There are people on this Zoom call right now who are suffering, who's having a hard time, who has bills they don't know how to pay, who lost a loved one during COVID, who got a bad diagnosis, whose husbands are furloughed, whose grandma is sick, who's trying to figure out how to have childcare, how to pay for childcare, if their child will be safe in school. What am I going to do all summer while I'm trying to have Zoom calls and my children are at home? All of those things are happening. What do you wish your team members knew? And how can you support them? As I close, I just want to give you some ideas of what you can do when you witness a microaggression. I want you to create a treasure chest of responses. Because if you don't know what you're going to say before it happens, the moment will be lost. Remember Dr. Gilliam? He didn't know what to say. The moment was lost. I showed that clip to a person I was going to be presenting with, a white male. And he said, Rosemarie, I have to tell you, that's never happened to me before. I present with women all the time and I've never seen that. You can't force people to see their bias. So what I said is, okay. When I say okay to my husband, he goes, it's not okay, but okay. So the next day when we're presenting, they said, this is Dr. So-and-so and Rosemarie Allen. And he stopped them. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, that's Dr. Rosemarie Allen. That meant the world to me because I wasn't in a position to correct it. But then he said something powerful right after when we were debriefing. He said, Rosemarie, I owe you an apology because I told you I'd never seen that happen before. I never noticed it happened before. It's probably happened time and time again, but it wasn't until you brought it to my awareness that I noticed. But I promise you, from now on, I will notice and I will correct it. But he's right. Had he not seen the clip the day before, if we didn't talk about how would you respond, then when it happened just the next day, he may not have known what to say. So create a treasure chest of responses. But before you do that, you have to decide you'll be someone who will speak up. You'll speak up against bigotry and you won't let hate have the last word. That you will have ready responses in your treasure chest. And they look like this. That offends me. I don't think that's funny. I'm surprised to hear you say that. Now, these are ready-made responses, but you can tailor them so that they're your own. You can say, what did you mean by that? So when Jesus's coworker said, do you have 2 offices? I don't see you here much. He can say, tell me what you mean by that. Because there's a meaning behind that question. Tell me what you mean by that. Or he could go to the third bullet. Tell me the point you're trying to make when you say that to me. You could also say, why would you say something like that? Did you mean to be hurtful when you said that? Or using that word as a put down offends me? Or even saying that word doesn't help other people feel safe here. So it's going to be really, really important that you have your ready responses. Write them down, put them on a tablet, practice saying it. Because I promise you, you'll hear the craziest things. You'll hear it. I mean, you'll hear a child say, I don't want to play with you, you're brown. Brown is ugly. What are you going to say? Because if you don't know beforehand, the moment will pass, or you'll say something like, we're all friends, you know? So create your treasure chest of responses. And
Uh-oh, we're frozen. We'll see if she comes back, and if not, we'll finish up and I'll make sure we get those last slides. Okay. Well, I will make sure to get the last slides for all of you. I want to thank you for being here. Hopefully you saw in the chat that we are giving away 25 books to people who complete the evaluation and say they want one. So the evaluation link is in the chat box. I'll also send it out by email. And then in addition to that, we are holding our third and final training by Dr. Rosemary Allen on August 17th, creating an anti-racist environment, and there are still slots available. So thank you all for coming. I will follow up with an email. I'm sorry about the last few minutes being cut off. Have a great day.